Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. What if the person you trusted most was suddenly caught in a shocking scandal? Diep is about to face this when James's mother, whom she has grown close to, becomes the center of a betrayal that threatens everything. With the truth coming to light, Diep is forced to choose: stay and fight with James, or walk away from the chaos. This is a story filled with love, betrayal, and tough choices. If you're hooked, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Help us hit 1,000 followers so we can keep sharing more stories like this. Let's get started. The night hung heavy, a silence thick enough to drown out the faintest sound. Diep lay on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. James slept beside her, his back sore from the long hours they had spent working earlier. She could hear his soft, rhythmic breathing, a comfort in itself. Yet it did nothing to calm the storm in her heart. Her gaze flickered to him, taking in the calm expression on his face, but even in his sleep, his body seemed to carry the weight of the world. Diep felt a knot form in her chest. She had never been one to shy away from difficult feelings, but now the complexity of her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Was this love? Or was it something more like a sense of obligation that kept her tethered to him? She thought about the past, the choices she had made that brought her to this point, and the path that lay before her, uncertain and fragile. Her fingers twitched, wanting to reach out and touch him, to bridge the gap between them. But something held her back. The unspoken words, the tension that hung in the air like a fog, kept her rooted to the bed. She was caught between two worlds, one of longing for something deeper and the other more practical, where reality and duty reigned. James shifted, groaning softly in his sleep, his discomfort palpable. Diep could not find the words to ease his pain, nor could she voice her own. As the night deepened, so did the questions in her mind. She closed her eyes, wondering how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine when nothing truly was. The next morning, the sun had barely risen, casting soft golden light through the window as Diep sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought. The quiet of the house felt foreign to her, as if everything had slowed down in the wake of the previous night's tension. She was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. James's mother entered the room, her presence warm and comforting like the sunlight spilling across the floor. "Diep," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of care and concern. Diep looked up, startled by the unexpected visit. "You've been through so much, my dear. And James, he's struggling more than he lets on. But I want you to know, if there's anything you need, anything at all, I will help." The words hit Diep like a wave. Her heart trembled, both touched and overwhelmed. She had always known of James's mother's kindness, but this offer, this unconditional promise of support, stirred something deep within her. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She had never experienced such warmth from a mother figure before. Her own mother had been absent, and this feeling, this gesture, struck her harder than she expected. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at James's mother. I don't know what to say," Diep whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect this." "Don't say anything," James's mother replied gently, her hand resting on Diep's. "You are like a daughter to me. We are family now, and families help each other through everything." Diep nodded, unable to speak, her heart full. The weight of the situation, The turmoil James was going through, the choices she faced, seemed a little more bearable with this promise of help. Diep stood by the window, the faint light of morning casting a quiet shadow over the room. The feeling of unease in her chest grew stronger, as though something was about to happen. James had left earlier, but the stillness of the house felt suffocating. Then her phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was James. His voice was strained, urgent. "Diep, you need to stay where you are. There's been an issue. Something's happened with my mother." "What's going on? How could she be involved?" Diep's voice faltered as confusion and fear gripped her. "She's been arrested," James said quickly. "They say she's involved in a fraudulent deal, but it's not true. It's all been set up by my secretary. She's the one behind this." Diep's heart sank. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, struggling to process the words. "The secretary? How could she do this?" "I don't know, but she's the one who manipulated my mother into signing fraudulent documents. It was all a setup, and now my mother is the one paying the price for it." The weight of his words hit Diep like a wave. She felt breathless as she realized the extent of the betrayal. James had trusted his secretary, and yet she had played a dangerous game, using his mother to cover up her own manipulations. The injustice of it all made Diep feel small, helpless, trapped in a situation that wasn't her own making. As the reality sank in, Diep understood that James was in the fight of his life, but now she was faced with her own choice, whether to stand by him or leave before she too became entangled in the chaos. After James's call, the entire atmosphere of the house shifted. Diep felt as though the walls were closing in on her, her thoughts swirling in the aftermath of the shocking news. She had known that James's life was complicated, but she had never imagined something as devious as this. His mother, who had always been kind and open-hearted toward Diep, was now at the center of a scandal that had nothing to do with her own choices. Diep couldn't stop thinking about how the secretary, someone she had only heard about in passing, had carefully orchestrated this betrayal. The house felt empty without James. He had left in a rush to handle the situation with his family, and Diep was left to sit in the quiet, alone with her racing thoughts. She understood James's desperation, but she also felt torn. The love she had for him, the connection they shared, now seemed like it could be buried under the weight of his family's problems. Was this the kind of life she wanted to be part of? Was she ready to be caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had nothing to do with her? She paced the room, her mind echoing with questions. She thought about the comfort James's mother had offered her the night before, how genuine it had felt. She could almost hear her words in her head. "You are like a daughter to me." And yet, the situation felt so far from what she had imagined. She didn't know if she was strong enough to face what was coming. The uncertainty of her own feelings, combined with the chaos surrounding James's family, left her feeling lost, unsure of her place. Later that day, Diep found herself in the garden, the weight of everything pressing heavily on her chest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet space. She was lost in her thoughts when James's mother appeared, her presence steady and calm despite the turmoil of the day. Diep hadn't expected to see her so soon, but when their eyes met, Diep could sense the strength beneath her calm exterior. The older woman sat down beside her, her gaze soft but determined. "Diep," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "I know this has been a lot for you, for James, for all of us. Diep turned toward her, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "I didn't expect any of this," Diep said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never imagined that his secretary would do something like this." James's mother nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a kind of sorrow that seemed to transcend the present moment. "People can be deceiving. But I want you to know that, despite all this, I will help you, and I will help James no matter what." Her words hung in the air, and Diep felt a rush of emotions she couldn't quite name. She had never had a mother figure to guide her, to offer her unconditional support. In that moment, she realized just how much it meant to her. But there was also a deep, gnawing fear inside her. How could she, someone so new to all of this, carry the weight of someone else's turmoil? "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be a part of this," Diep confessed, her voice shaking with vulnerability. "You are," James's mother said with unwavering certainty. "You're stronger than you think, and sometimes strength comes from knowing when to ask for help." Diep nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had come to love James, but now the decision seemed even more difficult. Should she stay and fight with him, or leave before she got too deep? But with James's mother's comforting words, Diep felt a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still a way to make this work. As the days went by, Diep found herself consumed by uncertainty. The chaos surrounding James's family and the mounting pressure weighed heavily on her heart. Every time she looked at him, she could see the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion from fighting a battle that seemed endless. He had always been the strong one, but now, Diep wondered if he could bear the weight of everything alone. She tried to be there for him, to offer support, but every time she did, it felt like there was a wall between them. He was distant, lost in his own world, and she felt like an outsider, unable to bridge the gap between them. The more she saw of his struggles, the more she questioned whether it was worth staying. She loved him, yes, but was her love enough to carry them both through the turmoil? One evening, as the night settled in, Diep was sitting alone, staring out the window, lost in thought. The door creaked open and James stepped inside. His presence was like a silent plea, and before Diep could say anything, he spoke. "I know I've been distant," James began, his voice low. "But I need you, Diep. I can't do this without you." His words hit her harder than she expected. Diep's heart fluttered as she looked at him, her fears mingling with a deep sense of longing. She had always known he was struggling, but hearing him admit it so openly broke through the walls she had built around her heart. "I'm scared too," Diep whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." James took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "We don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out, together." In that moment, Diep knew her choice. She would stay, not because everything was clear, but because love meant facing the unknown with him, side by side. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty and quiet determination. Diep found herself torn between the fear of the unknown and the pull of her feelings for James. Each time she saw him, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, but there was also a weight that seemed to follow him. He wasn't the man she had once admired for his strength. Now, he was a man drowning in his own burdens. She couldn't ignore the turmoil, the constant worry about his family, the chaos they were all trapped in. Yet, every time she thought about leaving, she was reminded of the promise they had made to each other. The decision, Diep realized, wasn't about whether she could handle the storm. It was about whether she could face it with him without turning away. There were no easy answers, no guarantees, but perhaps that was what love was, the willingness to embrace the uncertainty, to step into the unknown together. One afternoon, as the rain began to fall outside, Diep sat in the living room, her gaze fixed on the window. James entered quietly, his presence felt before he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "I know this is hard, and I understand if you're not sure about this, about us. But I want you to know I'm here, and I'm willing to fight for us." Diep's heart raced as she met his eyes. She had always feared making a decision, not knowing if it would be the right one. But now, as she looked at James, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't before. The road ahead would be uncertain, but it was theirs to walk together. "I'm here too," Diep replied softly, her voice steady. "I'll stay, not because it's easy, but because it feels right." In that moment, Diep knew that no matter what came next, they would face it as a team. The storm may have been brewing, but they had each other, and that, for now, was enough.
Diệp bị cuốn vào vòng xoáy của tình yêu, sự phản bội, những quyết định khó khăn khi mẹ của James, người đã và cô đã gắn bó, bị vu khống liên quan đến một vụ scandal do thư ký của James tạo ra. Thế giới của Diệp suy sụp khi James chiến đấu để minh oan cho mẹ mình. Diệp phải đối mặt với quyết định không thể nào dễ dàng hơn. Cô có ở lại và giúp anh vượt qua bão táp, hay rời đi khi quá sâu vào sự hỗn loạn này, và sức nặng của quyết định này kéo Diệp giữa tình yêu với James và nỗi sợ mất đi chính mình trong cuộc sống của gia đình anh, và cô sẽ ở lại hay rời đi để bảo vệ sự bình yên của mình.